The laugh wasn't loud, but it was heavy. The kind of wet, short chuckle my sister Corrine always used when she thought she had successfully hidden her malice behind a mouthful of mashed potatoes. I stood in the doorway of my mother's dining room, the autumn wind still rattling the screen door behind me, holding a single, aluminum-foiled tray of roasted Brussels sprouts that suddenly felt like an insult to the 22-pound turkey dominating the center of the table. "Oh, Talia," my mother murmured, not looking up from where she was meticulously carving the breast meat with an electric knife that buzzed like a trapped hornet. "We thought, well, Corrine said you'd probably bring him this year. I set a place for Lyle. I even used the good Lennox." "Lyle isn't coming, Mom," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor I had spent the entire 40-minute drive practicing to suppress. "Lyle is never coming here again." Corrine set her wine glass down with a sharp clink against the mahogany. "Again, Talia, it's been 6 months since the separation. Don't tell me you're still doing this dramatic solo act just to get out of cooking the mains. We all know he called you last week. He told Daddy offered to pay for your car transmission." My father didn't look at me either. He just reached for the gravy boat, his thumb leaving a greasy smudge on the porcelain handle. This was the ecosystem of my family. Lyle had spent 7 years quietly systematically stripping away my savings, my confidence, and my connection to my own life. But because he was a soft-spoken pharmacist who sent my mother orchids on her birthday, my absence was the flaw in the picture, not his betrayal. To them, my divorce wasn't an escape. It was an embarrassment they had to explain to the neighbors. "I don't need his money for the transmission," I said, walking over to the sideboard and sliding my tray into a small gap between the sweet potatoes and the cranberry sauce. Behind me, the front door clicked open again. My 14-year-old daughter, Maya, walked in, her school backpack slumped over one shoulder, her fingers tucked into the pockets of an oversized denim jacket that used to belong to me. She looked older today, the soft roundness of her childhood jawline hardening into something sharper, something that looked terrifyingly like resentment. "Sorry we're late," Maya said to the room, her voice bypassing her grandmother and landing directly on her aunt. "The traffic near the river was backed up." "Well, sit," my mother sighed, finally turning off the buzzing knife. The sudden silence in the room was louder than the motor had been. "Maya, sweetie, take your jacket off. You look like you're ready to run away." Maya didn't move toward the coat closet. Instead, she unzipped the small front pocket of her backpack and pulled out a thick, square envelope made of heavy linen paper, the exact ivory stationery Lyle used for his professional correspondence. It was slightly crumpled at the corners, stained with a faint circle of grease from where it had sat on our kitchen counter for 48 hours. "Grandma," Maya said, her voice dropping into a register that made my father stop his fork halfway to his mouth. "Before we eat, Mom told me I should read this out loud, since everyone keeps asking why Dad's chair is empty." "Maya," I said softly, touching her elbow. It wasn't a warning to stop, it was a steadying gesture. Corrine rolled her eyes, reaching for the wine bottle. "Oh, please. If this is another one of those therapeutic boundary statements your mediator made you write." "It's not from Mom," Maya interrupted, her eyes fixing onto Corrine's face with a cold, clear intelligence that made my chest ache. "It's a ledger. Dad left it in our old safe deposit box, but he forgot he gave me the spare key for my jewelry 2 years ago. I think Aunt Corrine should hear the first paragraph especially." Maya didn't wait for permission. She slipped her thumb under the heavy gold wax seal Lyle had used to close the envelope, a ridiculous, theatrical touch he'd adopted when he started making real money at the clinic, and tore it open. The sound of the thick paper ripping was the only noise in the room, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Maya, that's enough," my father said, his voice carrying that old, low authority he used when he wanted a conversation to die before it inconvenienced him. He didn't look at Maya. He looked at me, his eyebrows drawn together in a hard, paternal scowl. "Talia, control your daughter. This is Thanksgiving dinner. Whatever private mess you and Lyle are sorting out, it doesn't belong at your mother's table." "Actually, Dad," I said, my hands resting flat against the back of an empty dining chair, "this is exactly where it belongs, because Lyle didn't write this to me. He wrote it to himself. It's a journal of his investments, or rather, his joint ventures. Maya cleared her throat. She had my mother's posture when she wanted to be heard, shoulders back, chin level, but none of my mother's fragile compliance. She began to read, her voice steady, carrying the distinct, clipped cadence of a teenager who knew she held every card in the deck. May 14th, 2024, Maya read. Transfer completed from the joint commercial account to the Shell LLC under CR Consulting. Total amount, $42,000. Kareen confirmed receipt via the encrypted portal. She notes that Talia's signing authority on the primary account has been successfully restricted due to the updated operating agreement she signed during the transition. Talia believes the missing funds are due to a supply chain audit error at the West Side Pharmacy location. Kareen advises maintaining the narrative of financial strain for at least another 3 quarters to justify reducing Talia's personal draw. The gravy boat in my mother's hand didn't drop, but it tilted. A thick, dark stream of turkey gravy spilled over the side of the white porcelain, pooling onto the vintage lace tablecloth that had belonged to my grandmother. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, usually so sharp and critical when they landed on me, were wide, fixed entirely on her youngest daughter. Kareen's face didn't go pale. It went an ugly, mottled gray, starting at her throat and spreading up into her cheeks. She didn't look at me either. She looked down at her plate, her fingers tightening around her fork until her knuckles turned white. That's absolute fiction, Kareen stammered, her voice rising an octave, losing its smooth, patronizing edge. Talia, you're letting her read a forged document. Lyle is a clinical pharmacist. He doesn't even have a Shell LLC. You do, though, I said softly, the words coming out without any heat, just the cold weight of absolute certainty. CR Consulting, Kareen Rachel. You registered it 3 years ago when you told me you were helping Lyle with his tax strategy because I didn't have the head for corporate filing. Remember, Kareen, you sat in my kitchen, drank my coffee, and told me I was lucky to have a sister who looked out for my family's future. My father finally set his fork down. It made a dull, heavy thud against the wood. Kareen, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. What is she talking about? Kareen didn't answer him. She stared at the gravy stains spreading across the lace, her mouth open just enough for me to see the gray edge of a chewed mushroom. For 3 years, she had looked at me with a pity so heavy it felt like a physical weight, always checking her watch during our brief phone calls, always reminding me how lucky I was that Lyle provided for a woman who only managed a local bookstore. Dad, Kareen finally said, her voice thin and reedy. Lyle was restructuring the pharmacy's equity. It was a standard corporate shelter. Talia didn't understand the tax liabilities of the expansion, so I stepped in to handle the liability management. It wasn't a secret. Then why does the next entry call it the insulation fund? Maya asked. She didn't look up from the page, her finger tracing the clean, blocky lines of her father's handwriting. August 2nd. C shifted an additional $18,000 from the book inventory liquidation. Talia thinks the distributor cut our margins. C suggests we keep the pressure on her schedule, more weekend shifts at the register, so she doesn't have the energy to review the physical ledgers. If she asks about the missing profit sharing, tell her the landlord raised the triple net lease. Maya looked up then, her eyes landing squarely on her grandmother. That was the month Mom missed my 8th grade graduation dinner because she had to count the entire back stock by herself, Grandma. Remember, you told her she had her priorities backward. My mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with the string of cultured pearls my father had given her for their $40,000 anniversary. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet anymore. It was suffocating, the kind of stillness that happens right before a roof gives way under heavy snow. Talia, my mother whispered, her eyes darting between me and the crumpled linen paper. Did you know about this? I knew the numbers didn't work, I said, walking slowly toward the table. I didn't sit down. I just stood behind Maya, my hand resting on her shoulder. Her skin was warm, vibrating with the slight electric tremor of adrenaline. For 2 years, Lyle told me I was bad at business. He told me my little store was a black hole swallowing his hard-earned money. And every Sunday when I came here for dinner, Corrine would ask me if I'd considered closing down and taking a job at the school district. She said it would relieve the pressure on my marriage. I looked at Corrine, who was now aggressively folding her linen napkin into a tight, hard square, over and over again. You didn't want the bookstore to fail because it was a bad business, I said, the realization settling into my chest with a dull, cold ache. You wanted it to fail because as long as I was drowning in 80-hour work weeks, I wouldn't notice that my husband was buying a townhome in the city through your consulting firm. Townhome. My mother's voice didn't rise. It dropped into a hollow, reedy register I'd never heard from her before. She looked at Corrine, then at my father, her eyes frantic, searching for someone to tell her this was a misunderstanding, a joke in poor taste. Corrine, you told me you were helping Lyle find a commercial office space for the regional distribution contract. You said it was an investment for the whole family. It was an investment, Mom, Corrine snapped, her defense finally fracturing into a sharp, ugly defense mechanism. She threw the folded napkin onto her plate, right into the center of her untouched turkey. Lyle was going to lose everything in a messy divorce because Talia was mentally checked out for years. I was protecting the assets. If Talia had her way, she would have dragged the pharmacy down with her little poetry-reading hobby shop. My hobby shop paid for your daughter's dental alignment 2 years ago, Corrine, I said, my voice dropping an octave, perfectly steady. When your husband's firm downsized and you couldn't cover the deductible. Corrine's mouth snapped shut. The mottled red on her neck turned a deep, angry purple. Maya flipped the page. The crisp sound of the linen paper felt like a physical slap in the quiet room. There's more, Grandpa. This one is from October, right before Mom finally packed his bags. Maya, that's enough reading, my father said, but the command didn't have his usual iron weight behind it. He looked older suddenly, the lines around his mouth sagging as he stared at his youngest daughter. He had spent 30 years praising Corrine's business acumen while treating my quiet persistence as a generic female dependency. Let me see the document. No, Maya said simply. She didn't look at him. She looked at the paper. October 12th. Corrine finalized the transfer of the bookstore's digital inventory system to the new server. Talia's login credentials will expire on the 1st of the month under the automated security protocol. She will assume it's a technical glitch. By the time she gets the IT firm to restore access, the commercial lease transition will be locked in. Corrine's fee for the restructuring, $15,000, cash, delivered to the safe deposit box. Maya stopped. She looked up at her aunt, her 14-year-old face entirely devoid of the childhood warmth that used to make Corrine call her my favorite niece. You took $15,000 to help my dad lock my mom out of her own building, Maya said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, adult certainty. You did that while you were staying at our house because your guest bathroom was being remodeled. My mother slowly lowered herself into her chair, her knees seemingly unable to support her weight any longer. She didn't look at the turkey. She didn't look at the gravy. She just stared at the vintage lace, her fingers trembling against her lap. Corrine, my mother whispered, the words sounding like it had been dragged through gravel. Tell me this isn't true. Corrine didn't look at our mother. She didn't even look at my father, who was now leaning forward, his heavy forearms flat against the table, his eyes locked on her with a dark, judicial intensity. Instead, she fixed her gaze on me, her lips curling into a tight, defensive sneer that stripped away every remaining ounce of her polished, upper-middle-class veneer. You think you're so smart, don't you, Talia? She hissed, her voice a low, venomous vibration. You stand there acting like a martyr, letting your kid do your dirty work. Lyle didn't want to destroy you. He was bored. He was suffocating in that quiet, miserable little life you insisted on keeping him in. He wanted a partner who actually understood leverage, who understood growth. If I didn't help him structure those accounts, he was going to take that capital and move it out of state anyway. At least this way, the money stayed in the family ecosystem. The family ecosystem. I repeated the words, letting them hang in the warm, savory-smelling air of the dining room. It felt surreal, the smell of roasted rosemary and butter clashing with the absolute rot of her admission. You call stealing my life's work, my retirement, and my daughter's college fund keeping it in the family. It wasn't your college fund, Maya, Corrine snapped, turning her head sharply toward my daughter. Your father was going to reinvest it. He was going to give you a real future, not some tiny percentage of a failing brick-and-mortar storefront. Don't speak to her, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a density that made Corrine instantly flinch back into her chair. Don't you ever look at her or speak to her again. My father slowly reached across the table. His large, weathered hand, the hand of a man who had spent 40 years running a regional supply chain and prided himself on absolute corporate rectitude, closed around the edge of Corrine's wine glass. He didn't pick it up. He just moved it 3 inches to the left, away from her hand, a small, devastating gesture of removal. Corrine, my father said, his voice coming from somewhere deep in his chest. Get out of this house. Corrine blinked, a sudden, panicked break appearing in her armor. Dad, wait. You don't understand the tax implications of what Lyle was doing. I understand a thief, my father interrupted, his eyes ice-cold as they drilled into his favorite daughter. And I understand a traitor. You sat at my table last month and watched your sister ask for a small loan from me to cover her commercial insurance, knowing you had $15,000 of her stolen cash sitting in a box. You let me tell her no. You let me tell her she needed to learn fiscal responsibility. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my 42 years, I saw something like shame flicker across my father's face. He didn't apologize. He wasn't capable of that yet. But the way his eyes dropped down to my worn, salt-stained winter boots spoke volumes. Get your things, Corrine, he repeated, his voice dropping into a register that brooked no argument. Now! Corrine didn't storm out. That would have required a dignity she didn't possess. Instead, she rose slowly, her chair legs scraping an agonizingly loud, jagged line across the hardwood floor. She grabbed her designer leather coat from the back of the chair, her movements clumsy, her face still trapped in that ugly, mottled grimace of exposed guilt. You're all making a massive mistake, she muttered, looking at the wall somewhere between my mother and father. When Lyle's lawyers finalized the corporate division, you're going to see I was the only one trying to keep the pieces together. Nobody answered her. The silence followed her out of the dining room and down the hallway. We listened to the heavy thud of the front door closing, followed a moment later by the distant, sharp rev of her SUV's engine as she backed out of the driveway too fast, spraying gravel against the garage door. Inside, the hum of the refrigerator returned, filling the void. My mother looked down at the table, her hands hovering helplessly over her plate. The turkey is going to get cold, she whispered, her voice sounding incredibly small, like a child lost in a large house. It was her coping mechanism. If she could just focus on the domestic details, the structural collapse of her family might not be real. Let it, my father said. He stood up, his joints popping slightly in the quiet. He didn't look at my mother. He walked around the long mahogany table, past the empty chair where Corrine had sat, and stopped 3 feet away from me. He looked at Maya first, reaching out a hand to gently touch the top of her backpack. You're a sharp girl, Maya, he said quietly, just like your mother. Then he looked at me. My father was not a man who hugged. He was a man of small, heavy gestures. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and took out a small, laminated card, the private direct line to his personal attorney, a man he'd retained for 30 years who specialized in forensic accounting and estate fraud. He placed it in my palm and closed my fingers over it. Call Arthur on Friday morning, he said, his voice thick but firm. Tell him everything. I'll call him tonight to let him know he's representing you and that the billing goes directly to my office. Dad, I started, the cold lump in my throat finally softening, threatening to turn into tears I didn't want them to see. The bookstore. The lease transition is scheduled for next Monday. I don't know if Arthur can stop it in time. Maya stepped up beside me, slipping the ivory linen letter back into her denim jacket pocket. He won't have to stop it, Mom, she said, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of her mouth. Because I didn't read the last paragraph. I frowned, looking down at my daughter. The heavy card from my father's attorney was still pressed into my palm, its sharp edges digging into my skin, but my focus completely shifted to Maya. What do you mean, sweetie? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What's in the last paragraph? My mother finally looked up from her ruined lace tablecloth, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. Even my father stayed frozen, his hand still resting on the back of the chair Corrine had just abandoned. The room seemed to contract, centering entirely on the 14-year-old girl standing by my side. Maya pulled the ivory envelope back out. She didn't open it this time. She just looked at the neat, blocky handwriting peeking through the torn edge. "Dad was always so proud of his digital security," Maya said, her voice carrying a quiet, cinematic chill that made the hair on my arms stand up. "He thought because he changed the administrator passwords on the bookstore's server, he had completely cut you out. But he forgot that, when he bought the new inventory software last year, he used my tablet to set up the recovery email and the two-factor authentication." She looked at me, her young face illuminated by a sudden, fierce pride. "He used my school email address as the backup, Mom, because he thought I was just a kid who only used it for homework." A slow, blossoming warmth began to spread through my chest, replacing the icy dread that had lived there for months. I stared at her, everything clicking into place. "The automated security protocol," I murmured, remembering the phrase she had read just minutes before. "The one that was supposed to lock me out on the 1st of the month." "It didn't lock you out," Maya said, a genuine, sharp smile breaking across her face. "Because 3 days ago, when the system sent the confirmation link to change the primary ownership to Aunt Corinne's consulting firm, I didn't click approve. I clicked report fraud. And then I changed the primary administrator email to your private account, Mom. And I updated the bank routing numbers for the online store back to your personal savings." She turned the envelope over in her hands, her fingers tapping against the heavy wax seal. "The last paragraph is Dad complaining to himself that the server transition failed on Tuesday morning. He wrote that he couldn't understand why the system was locking him out. He thought it was a glitch with the IT company. He has no idea that he doesn't own the digital storefront anymore. You do. Completely." My father let out a long, slow breath, a sound that was half sigh, half laugh. It was the closest thing to absolute vindication I had ever heard from him. He looked at Maya, then at me, and for the first time in 7 years, the heavy, suffocating shadow of Lyle's control felt entirely lifted from my shoulders. "Well," my father said, his voice regaining its old, solid weight as he looked at the cooling turkey in the center of the table, "it seems Lyle and Corinne are going to have a very busy Friday morning." The dining room fell into a heavy, meditative quiet. My mother slowly rose from her seat, her movements no longer frantic, but deliberate. She didn't look at the gravy stain or the carving knife. Instead, she walked over to the sideboard, picked up the tray of roasted Brussels sprouts I had brought, and set it down right in the center of the table, displacer close to the turkey. "Sit down, Talia," she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding a rare, soft warmth. "Maya, sit, let's eat." I pulled out a chair for Maya and then sat down beside her. For the past 6 months, every meal had felt like a rehearsal for my own disappearance, eating standing up at the kitchen counter, picking at leftovers while calculating the cost of groceries, feeling the constant, dull ache of being the family failure. But as I picked up my napkin, the fabric felt real, grounded. The air in the room was clear. My father sat back down at the head of the table. He didn't pick up his fork right away. He just looked at the 3 of us, the remaining pieces of his family. "Arthur is going to need the physical copy of that ledger, Maya," he said, his eyes resting on her denim jacket pocket. "And any screenshots you have of the email logs. Can you print them out tomorrow?" "I already saved everything to a secure cloud drive, Grandpa," Maya said, taking a small helping of sweet potatoes. "And I sent a copy to Mom's lawyer weeks ago. I just wanted to wait until today to show Aunt Corinne, so she wouldn't have time to clean out the safe deposit box before the banks closed for the holiday." I stared at my daughter, a mixture of awe and a strange, protective sorrow washing over me. She had carried this weight alone for weeks, quietly assembling the scaffolding of our defense while I was still crying in the shower, wondering how I was going to pay the rent on our 2-bedroom apartment. She shouldn't have had to be this strong. But looking at her now, seeing the calm, unyielding focus in her eyes, I realized she wasn't just surviving Lyle's wreckage. She was dismantling it. "You're a remarkable kid, Maya," I whispered, reaching over to squeeze her hand under the table. I'm your daughter, she said simply, looking up at me with absolute clarity. You built that store from nothing, Mom. They didn't get to have it. Across the table, my mother placed a small, perfectly cut piece of turkey onto my plate. She didn't say she was sorry for the years she spent comparing me to Corrine. She didn't say she was sorry for believing Lyle's smooth, poisonous lies. But as she met my eyes, her lips trembled and she reached out, her fingers briefly brushing against my wrist. I'm glad you came alone today, Talia, my mother said softly. I really am. The dinner proceeded in a quiet, rhythmic cadence. The tension didn't disappear. The empty chair where Corrine had sat remained a gaping wound in the room's geometry, but the pressure had shifted. It was no longer pushing down on me. We were halfway through the meal when the low, distinct buzz of a cell phone vibrated against the wood of the sideboard. It was my phone, sitting inside my purse. The screen lit up against the dark leather. I didn't have to look at it to know who it was. The timeline was matching up. It was Thursday evening. The automated server reports for the West Side Pharmacy location always generated at 6:00 p.m. Lyle had just tried to log into the corporate backend to verify the lease transition. And for the first time in 7 years, his password didn't work. I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't even move my hands from my lap. The phone vibrated again, a longer, more frantic sequence of buzzes that rattled against the ceramic base of a nearby lamp. Let it ring, my father said, not looking up from his plate. He cut a piece of turkey with deliberate precision. A man who thinks he's an architect shouldn't complain when his foundation turns out to be sand. Maya smiled into her water glass, taking a slow sip. The vibrating stopped, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the room, only for the phone to begin buzzing again less than 10 seconds later. This time, it was followed by the sharp, high-pitched ping of a text message. Then another, and another. Lyle was realizing in real time that the digital walls he had spent months building around my life had not only crumbled, but that he was locked outside the gates. I reached back, pulled the phone from my bag, and flipped it face down on the sideboard without unlocking the screen. The glass back of the phone caught the warm reflection of the dining room chandelier, a steady, bright glow that didn't flicker. He's going to call Corrine next, my mother said, her voice hollow, but devoid of the panic she had shown earlier. She was staring at the empty chair across from her, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. When he can't get a hold of you, he'll call her. He can try, I said softly, sitting back in my chair. But Corrine is currently driving back to the city, realizing that the $15,000 she took in cash is documented in a federal-level paper trail. I doubt she's going to answer his calls right now. She's too busy trying to figure out how to save herself. My father set his fork down, his eyes fixed on me. Tomorrow morning, Talia, Arthur will have a forensic team on those accounts by noon. If Lyle has been skimming from the pharmacy's physical inventory to fund that townhome, we'll find it, every single cent. I don't care about the townhome, Dad, I said, and as the words left my mouth, I realized with a sudden, beautiful shock that they were entirely true. He can keep the brick and the mortar. I want my name off his liabilities, and I want my daughter's future secured. That's all. You'll get both, my father said, his voice dropping into that low, absolute register that meant a decision had been finalized. We finished the rest of the meal in a quiet, grounded rhythm that felt less like a holiday dinner and more like the first night after a long, exhausting war. The food was warm, the room was quiet, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel the need to apologize for taking up space at the table. When the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8, Maya and I stood up to help my mother clear the dishes. As I gathered the silver, my phone lit up one final time on the sideboard. It wasn't a call. It was a single text message from Lyle, the preview visible even on the locked screen. Talia, what did you do? I looked at the screen for a long moment, the letters blurring slightly under the warm dining room lights. I didn't reply. I slid the phone into my pocket, picked up the heavy porcelain gravy boat, and walked into the kitchen, leaving the question unanswered in the dark. The kitchen smelled of lemon dish soap, and the sharp, clean scent of the cold night air drifting through the slightly open window above the sink. My mother stood beside me, her hands submerged in the soapy water, her movements slow and mechanical. For 30 years, this had been her sanctuary, a place where everything could be washed clean, stacked neatly, and put back into its proper cupboard. But tonight, the routine felt brittle. "He used to talk to your father about the pharmacy's expansion like it was a family legacy," my mother said quietly, not looking at me as she scrubbed the gravy boat. "Lyle would sit out on the patio, drinking that expensive scotch he always brought, and tell us how he was securing Maya's future. And Corrine would just nod and smile." She paused, her hands resting on the bottom of the porcelain sink. A single tear escaped her eye, catching the harsh light of the fluorescent bulb overhead before tracking down her cheek. "I thought I was being a good mother by encouraging you to hold on to him," she whispered. "I thought you were just being stubborn, Talia. I told your father that you were letting your pride ruin a good marriage." I reached over, taking the wet towel from the counter, and gently took the clean gravy boat from her hands. "You didn't know, Mom. Lyle spent 7 years making sure nobody knew. He didn't just deceive me, he studied this family. He knew exactly what buttons to push to make himself look like the anchor and me look like the storm." Behind us, the swinging door to the kitchen creaked open. My father walked in, carrying a heavy stack of dessert plates. He didn't usually help clear the table. That was a boundary he had strictly maintained since the 90s. But tonight, he looked like a man trying to find a purpose in a house that had suddenly grown unfamiliar. He set the plates on the counter, his eyes finding mine. "I just spoke with Arthur on his personal cell," my father said, his voice dropping into that low, flat rasp he used for serious business. "He's canceling his Friday morning tea time. He wants you and Maya at his downtown office at 9 sharp. He said if the two-factor authentication is tied to Maya's school email, we have a digital chain of custody that Lyle's legal team won't be able to touch." "Is he going to try to lock the store physically?" I asked, a sudden spike of anxiety tightening my chest. "He still has a set of keys to the front door of the bookstore." My father reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy keychain, detaching a single, brass key. He slid it across the laminate counter toward me. "That's the master key to the commercial strip," he said. "I bought that property through my holding company 10 years ago, Talia. Lyle thinks he's dealing with an independent commercial landlord. He doesn't know I bought out the majority share of the plaza block last winter. Tomorrow morning at 7, a locksmith will be there to change the deadbolts. If he shows up with his keys, he won't even be able to get past the vestibule." I stared at the brass key resting between us. For years, I had felt like a tenant in my own life, constantly waiting for the eviction notice from a husband who controlled the bank accounts and a family that controlled the narrative. Maya walked into the kitchen then, her denim jacket finally draped over the back of a kitchen chair. She looked tired, the sharp adrenaline of the dining room drama finally fading from her face, leaving her looking like the 14-year-old girl she actually was. She walked straight to the refrigerator, pulled out the pitcher of sweet tea, and poured herself a glass. "Dad just sent another text," she said casually, leaning against the counter. "He sent it to my phone this time." My hand tightened around the drying towel. "What did he say, Maya?" "He asked if I knew where his green ledger was," she said, taking a sip of the tea. "He said if I found it and brought it back to his apartment tonight, he'd buy me that laptop I wanted for high school." She looked up at my father, then at me, her eyes completely clear. "I told him I didn't know anything about a ledger, and then I blocked his number.